Hi everyone, this is a video to show you how to mix the colors for the flower painting from the Zoom class. That part didn't get recorded, so I'm just doing this over again. And I'm going to use the same four colors that you have: yellow ochre, red, and ultramarine blue, and a white. Okay, so I'll be using a palette knife for this because it's easy to clean up and it's good for scraping. If you don't have one, you can use a paintbrush. And I'm going to start by squeezing out a bit of each color. So something to remember when you're mixing your colors is that each color has a starting place on the color wheel. So if you look at the color wheel like this, let's say you're trying to mix this purple. So purple's made with blue and red, right? To get a bright saturated purple, you want to use the blue and the red that's closest to the purple. If you use a blue that's closer to the green or a red that's closer to orange, you're going to get something that's more like a brown because those tones are further away from the color that you're trying for. So the ultramarine blue is pretty close to purple. You would not want to use like cerulean or cyan. For the reds, you would want to avoid using cadmium to mix a purple because the cadmium is pretty close to the orange. Okay, so let's start with this. First, I want to get that purple of the flowers. I'm going to take a bit of red, a bit of blue, and push them together like this. Another thing to keep in mind is that some pigments are stronger than others. So if you use a one-to-one mix, that does not necessarily mean that you'll get a equally balanced mix because, for example, phthalo blue is a really strong blue and can overpower another color that you're mixing it with. So always start with small quantities and add more of whichever you need. Okay, so it can be hard to see what color it is when it's dark like this, so you can scrape the color out and that will give you a better idea. So I have this kind of violet here. Now I want a purple that's a bit more blue. And of course you can use whatever colors you want for the flowers. They're your flowers after all. I'm going to add some white to each of these to lighten them up. Something to note is that white, the kind of titanium white that you can get easily here, is usually like cool. There's a hint of blue to it. It's not blue, but it's a cool tone. So if you're mixing it with something that's warm, it will lower the temperature of your paint. And I mean temperature in terms of like color wheel, not like degrees Celsius. Okay, now I have this pinkish and slightly bluer purple. I'm going to mix the green for my leaves. So I'm just wiping this off on a rag here. You can also just wash it, but I'm trying to avoid introducing too much water at this point. For a green, you want yellow and blue. I'm going to need a bit more blue. And I want a slightly bluer green as well. So let's put more blue in here. Okay, now I want a white tint of this. So when you add white to any color, it's called a tint of that color. To get a lighter version of a color on your painting, you can also just use more water, but that will give you a more watercolor effect and not the kind of solid gouache look. So I think this flower needs to be lighter. I'm just gonna go in with an opaque pink. And see, it's easier to make it lighter than it would be with watercolor. So I'm still doing all this with the same brush. Okay. Now I want to define some of these leaves a little more. I'm going to mix some more blue in. I'm going to use blue to get the deepest parts of the shadows. I'm switching to a pointy brush now. I'm using some blue mixed with the darker purple. And I'm spraying again because they're drying out. when I'm making lines, especially if it's something with a lot of line work, I try and make sure there's varied lines as well. So thicker lines, thinner lines, shorter lines, longer lines. You don't want every line in your painting to look the same. And when I get to this point, I try and let the brush control the shape more than I do. And I don't worry too much about, oh, what is this shape that I'm painting? What should a leaf look like, or what should a flower look like? I'm just more of thinking what makes the painting look good. I'm put in those yellow spots at the center of the flower. I don't know what they're called. Stamens?
I think that's right.
Yeah, something like that. Biology was a long time ago. So I'm mixing some yellow ochre with white for that. And they have little shadows around them. So if you accidentally make something too dark, you can lift it off with some water on a clean brush, or you can use your finger. Or you can use a clean part of your rag and just dab at it. So if you do it quickly enough, it should be easy to get off. I'm mostly just defining each petal here. let's see. I want to add some lighter pieces around the edge. So you can see intentionally I've made this part have the highest contrast. You don't want the same level of contrast at every part of your painting, because there needs to be like a resting point and a focal point. If everything is too sharp, it doesn't feel natural, because our eyes don't see things that way. And when you make a painting that looks like that, it looks kind of unnatural. Well, there is a photorealistic style that aims for that, but it doesn't quite have the soothing effect that I think people are looking for in a flower painting. Okay, I want to go back in with some highlights on the leaves. So that's a white mixed into the green. And I want a bit more red in some of those leaves. Okay, I want to put in the background and the vase now. So if you make an accident like this, just wash it off. So that's just water and a rag, and you can clean it off like that. Okay. I'm going to mix a brown out of whatever's already here. So I want yellow, some red. I do it this way just to use up the extra paint I have on my palette and not waste it. So that's why I leave painting the background to the last. And that way you get a sampling of all the colors that are on your palette, which makes for a more cohesive color. I can lay that in with a large brush. Don't worry if you don't get those clean edges, because you can always go back and cover them up. Okay. When this is dry, I'll go back in with another layer so that it becomes smoother. For the vase, I want something a bit warmer. So I'll take some of this yellow. And I want a slightly darker shadow over there. Just checking if this part is dry enough for a second layer. Not really, so I'm going to do a bit more detailing on the flowers. How's everyone doing with their painting? Do you need any tips, or do you want me to look at what you're doing?
Sounds like they're all very focused. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions, or if you want to share how everything looks. We have a focused group.
Okay, I'm going to go back in with a second layer to the background now. If anyone has other unrelated questions about painting, I'm happy to answer them too, or about color theory, drawing.
How long have you been painting?
Probably since first grade art class, I think is the, and then I just never stopped.
Well, that's one way to get good at it.
I learned a lot from an artist called James Gurney. He is the writer and creator of Dinotopia, the kids' books.
I loved those books.
He's a great gouache and watercolor and oil painter, and he posts a lot of like tutorial videos or process videos on his YouTube channel and his blog. They're all free, so if you're interested in learning more, you can go check that out. He also has a great book called Color and Light, which is just color theory for any medium. I believe the library also offers access to like schoolism, or what is it called? Some free art classes online, like Linda or...
We do. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. Creative Bug. We have Creative Bug. Yes. Can you repeat the artist's name?
Oh, here, let me type it into chat.
Okay.
Yes, my keyboard is under my palette. So.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the link to his blog as well.
Gurney Journey. Perfect.
So at this point, I like to step away from the painting and just come back to it maybe a few hours or a few days later, because if you've been looking at something for a while, it can be hard to tell what else it needs, or hard to tell if it's time to stop. You don't want to overwork something because then you can't really get that spontaneity back.
What is the process when you have to go back to the painting? You know, how do you reactivate the color? Do you use water again?
Well, because it's gouache, you don't want to reactivate it. You want it to sit where it is and not be disturbed by any new color you put on top of it. Yeah. Because gouache can be reactivated. When I put a layer on top of something, I use a very light touch and try not to scrape at what's already underneath there. If you do want to disturb the bottom layer, you can use a knife to scratch at the paint before it's completely dry. So like 90% dry, you would scrape to make some. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, if you see in this painting here, there's these branches here. So this is when I use the tip of a knife to scratch into that black and brown area before it's completely dry, so that it has the appearance of being left white while I actually painted completely over it. This can be faster than leaving those areas. You can see more of it here. So great for branches or for subtle patterns. And here's one where I try to get that effect by using white paint, and you can see it's just not as effective. You can re-wet it to some extent, but it doesn't look as good. It'll look like it'll look accidental because there's like a backwash effect when you do that. Let me see if I have examples. Okay, so I don't know how well you can see it, but on this house, there's like, this part's smooth, but this part's kind of rough because that's where I put in another layer because I was trying to change the color. And you can see that it just doesn't look as intentional. It can be an interesting texture if that's what you're going for. So,
It looks a little like stucco.
yeah, but this was not a stucco house.
No, well, you could pretend.
Any more questions? Like any examples of things you want to see? Okay.
All right, don't be shy. We have a very focused group, which is a good thing. Does anybody want to share what their paintings are looking like, or do you want to just have some more time with them? Okay, we have another question.
Gouache over watercolor. Yes, most of my paintings are a mix of gouache and watercolor. I rarely use only one. So let me show you some examples and tell you how I decide what to use when. Okay. So this is view from my porch when it's snowing. I knew I wanted most of the painting to be left white because it's easier to get snow that way. So you can see the areas where there's snow over the dark parts, that's gouache because you can't get that effect with watercolor. And most of the other parts are just watercolor because I didn't need them to be very dark. For something like this, I knew that painting each individual rock would be hard to do in watercolor because you'd have to avoid each shape when you paint in the grass. So I did the grass as a flat watercolor layer. Then I used gouache to go in with the rocks. And also this effect of the pebbles here, you can only do that with gouache too. So that's what that is. Here's something that's all watercolor because I knew that the effect of the water is best achieved using watercolor because you want that wash and that bleeding effect like for the reflections here. Here's another one with a mix. So everything had a base layer of watercolor because I wanted things to be like airy and light in the background and in the shadows. But when it's a solid object, I tend to use gouache because that makes it feel more present. And it's easier to get that modeling, like the shape and volume effects. So like for reflections like this, I tend to leave it white and paint around it using gouache because I want the contrast there, a really dark gouache against the white of the paper. Something that I think gouache is really useful for is getting like dappled light effects. When you see sunlight coming through the leaves on a tree and it has those spots of light on rocks or on the leaves themselves, it's really much easier if you paint the dark color first and then go in with the light gouache on top of that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I I did have a question about the brushes that you used for this painting. Can you remind us which brushes you used for which parts?
So almost all of this is done using this 1/2-inch flat brush. So sometimes I do this, like split it. If I want to get like a pattern, a stripy pattern, I can just paint like this instead of painting each stripe by itself. But otherwise, you want to use it as a single flat shape. If your hairs are splitting, just wet it in your jar and then press it together on your palette like this, and it should come to a flatter tip. So that's all the blocking in of the large shapes, and I use the corner to get into those small areas. I use a round brush or a pointy brush for lines and any smaller details. I try to use a large brush as much as I can because it's more efficient. If you're not confident with that, you can use a pointy brush for all of it. It just takes so much longer. I use this brush for foliage, for anything that I want a pointy shape on. So you can do this kind of thing where you vary the weight. You can also use the side of it to like, scrape to get that kind of texture. And I also like to splay it out sometimes for leaves. So kind of like doing this kind of thing can help suggest a tree if you don't need it in a lot of detail. And then you paint a few leaves in. So I think of this as more like as a chisel, like you're carving a shape out. And I think of this more as a texture tool. So if you want me to recommend some brushes, I like the Jack Richardson travel set because they're pretty cheap, and for gouache, you don't need really good natural hairs. Synthetic is fine. And they're short enough that you can easily take them out painting. The thin brushes I use, this is a Kuretake. It's a Japanese brush. I think it's called the Menso. It comes to a really fine point. I've been using it for 5 or 6 years, and it's still very sharp. If you're going to be doing really big paintings, I also like using a large brush. This is 1.5 inches, or a mop brush to do like big flat washes, so you don't have to work over them so many times. And this is probably my favorite shape, the chisely blocking in shape. So I have like 4 sizes of these, about 3 or 4 sizes of these, and I think that's really all you need. Here's a mop brush. You can see compared to a bright, it has a lot more body this way. We call this the belly, the part that goes out like this. And you can see this one, even though it's wider, it's actually flatter. So, different purposes. Here's a more traditional Western round brush. Generally, you want something with longer bristles. Like you don't want something like this where the bristles are short. This is more of an oil painting brush. You want long bristles because they hold more water.
That makes sense.
Any other questions about tools or anything really?
Let's see, how's everybody doing? Do you have any questions about the painting? Or are you just focused on doing your own painting? Having a great creation in front of you?
I have a question.
Okay.
When we began the painting, you drew curves like for the flowers. Did you have in mind the type of flower that you were going to draw? Because I didn't quite get the kind of flower that you were aiming for.
No, I did not have a type of flower in mind. I just was looking at a picture a few hours ago, and I knew the color that I wanted and the general shape of the leaves, but I'm not trying to make a scientific botanical drawing. That's actually in next month's class at Hatch, which is a different thing. I'm trying to make more of a pretty flower drawing. It's not going to be accurate.
Thank you.
But you can do it that way if you want. Here, why don't I show you my palette as well? Okay, so when I go out painting and I want to bring my gouache paints, these are cubes, right? But if I'm painting outside, I don't want to be carrying all this. So you can use like a airtight container to keep all your paints together in one place. Let me try to find mine. Somewhere around here.
Yes, the tubes are challenging to empty, I have to tell you. Putting together the kits was interesting.
That's what you should want.
Well, thank you for putting together the kits.
Oh, you're welcome. I think it was the white one that sprung a leak. That was challenging. Eben, when you have a second, can you bring the painting back so people can use it for reference?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question about brand of paint, something that's on the cheaper side, but still good quality.
Winsor & Newton Designer Gouache is a reliable and affordable brand. I think if you're going to be using like anything cheaper than that, I don't think it's worth buying gouache, because good gouache is effective and bad gouache is pointless, because when you mix the colors they go muddy, and if you don't want to spend money on good gouache, you should just get cheap watercolors instead, which they don't make your painting bad just because they're bad, but bad gouache makes your painting bad just by itself. So you have a hard time telling if the problem is you or the paints. It's probably the paints.
That'll be your story anyway.
So the kind I use, Holbein, this is like the best in the market right now. It's also the most expensive, but it lasts quite a while. I paint pretty much every day, and I buy a new set maybe like twice a year or three quarters of a year through. Winsor & Newton is very reliable as well, and Daniel Smith. and Graham Schmink. Let me find that. They all also make watercolors, which tend to be cheaper and last a longer time. And it's better to buy a few good colors than a lot of bad paint. If you're starting out, I recommend white, ultramarine blue, a yellow ochre, a cadmium yellow, a cadmium red, alizarin crimson, and a Prussian blue. So 7 colors are enough for most things that you want to do. If you want to add one more, I think a green is helpful if you're doing a lot of landscapes. What I like about Holbein is that it stays wet in the tube. So I have bought a lot of paints from many brands over the years, and this is the only brand where after like 6 or 7 years, it's still squishy in the tube. Some of the Winsor & Newton ones, after a few years, they get hard and dried out. That's not really a problem if you use the paints up fast, but I buy large tubes because I know I'll use them up, and it's disappointing when they go hard after only half the tube's gone. And I like the range of colors as well. But they both have pretty good ranges. It's more like what your painting style is. If you're,
Great question.
Mhm.
I was just going to say that I thought that I was surprised by the range of colors that you can get just out of the 4 colors that you used this evening. So
Yeah, so that's because you want to pick a red and a blue that can work together well. In a limited palette, you want to make sure that you pick colors that can make a large range. For watercolors, I really do like Winsor & Newton a lot. If I can get it open. Okay. This is a beginner set. I've used this since high school. It's been over 10 years. They're still going. So cheap and last a long time. You can also get watercolor in tubes, but those don't last long because I use them very generously. And yes. And for large paintings, you probably want to use a full pan set instead of the half pan that I just showed. Because if you are using a large brush and you're trying to stick it in that tiny half pan, you're going to damage your brush eventually. Okay, and I also want to link to this wash palette. So there's a palette that I use for painting with gouache outside because it's airtight and your paints don't dry out. Where's that link? I'm not being sponsored. I just really like this palette.
well, you have experience with them, so you should have an opinion at this point.
Okay, So this is a link to a 24 well palette where you can squeeze in all your different colors, and you can snap the lid closed. The paints will stay wet and never dry out. You just have to keep spraying it. But the problem is if you don't paint for a long time, they get moldy. Only recommend this if you're going to paint at least once a week. And even then, you should clean your paints regularly to make sure they stay unmoldy. They also include a scraper thing that you can use to clean it. It's changed my painting life.
And what do you call the scraper again?
Sorry?
What do you call the scraper again? Like if you were searching for it, what would you call it?
Well, it's included with the palette. I don't know. It's not a canonical tool. It just comes with this palette.
Oh, okay.
I guess you could use a palette knife if you don't want to buy that. Palette knife works well too.
Okay.
Yeah. Any last questions or comments, anything?
Just want to say thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for coming. Hope you had fun.
I did. My painting didn't come out so good, but I learned a lot. So thank you. I'll do it again.
Good. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Eben, for teaching us, and we can let you go, but I am going to keep the channel open with our painting picture up, just in case people want to, add to their painting or want to catch up. So I'll leave that open for a little bit. Try to play some classical music and give you some more painting time.